the scroll. And do you remember what those 6 seals were? The first seal was the Antichrist. The second seal was war. And then the third seal, famine. And the fourth seal, death, I think. And then, okay, let's see. The first was a white horse, and that was the Antichrist. The second was a fiery red horse, and that was war. And the third was a black horse, and that was famine. And then, let's see, then there was the pale horse, and its rider's name was Death. And those are the 4 horsemen. And then there was the 5th seal, and the 5th seal was the souls of the saints under the altar crying, "How long?" And then the 6th seal was the cosmic disturbance. And at the cosmic disturbance, we saw that the 144,000 Israelis were sealed. Something was put on their forehead as a sign that they should never experience God's punishment. They are going to be protected even though they stay on the earth during the day of the Lord. And then we saw the great multitude that I believe is the church, and they came out of the great tribulation and into heaven. That's what I believe is the rapture. Okay? Now we have come to chapter 8. And in chapter 8, I'm going to start by reading verses 1 to 5. And again, the he that is referred to here is the Lamb who was on the throne. And that's in verse 1, the he. Okay? When he opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about a half hour. And I saw the 7 angels who were standing before God, and 7 trumpets were given them. Another angel who had a golden censer, came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense to offer, with the prayers of all God's people on the golden altar in front of the throne. The smoke of the incense, together with the prayers of God's people, went up before God from the angel's hand. And the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and hurled it on the earth. And there came peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes, something's in my mouth there. Flashes of lightning and an earthquake. So we see in this passage that the Lord Jesus, the Lamb on the throne, opens the 7th seal. So you know what happens when the 7th seal comes off the scroll? Now the scroll can open up and you can read both sides. Okay? So when he opened the scroll, what happened? Well, it says that there was silence in heaven for about a half hour. I don't know about you, but I have had times in my life where I had to ask people to be silent. And one of them was when I was a daycare teacher, and I asked the kids to be silent for 10 minutes. That was one of my jobs during the day. Just calm down, everybody. Be silent for 10 minutes. They were supposed to take a nap, but the daycare leader said, as long as they're quiet for 10 minutes, we'll let them go without a nap. Some of them, when they were quiet for 10 minutes, fell asleep. But others of them refused, and then I read them a story after the 10 minutes was over. Anyways, getting kids to be quiet for 10 minutes is a challenge. But can you imagine getting a whole host of people in heaven, millions of people, to be silent for a half hour? What do you think would cause people to be silent for half an hour? I think, and if I'm reading this correctly, I think it was the shock of what was going to happen. See, we have had 2,000 years, I put the word gap here, but I'd like to erase the last two letters. We have had 2,000 years of God's grace. We have had a time period when God rushed to show mercy to anyone and everyone who repented. But at this point, when the day of the Lord begins, I'm not talking about the birth pains, I'm not talking about the first 3.5 years, I'm not even talking about the Great Tribulation. But after the Great Tribulation, when God's wrath comes, God changes his method of dealing with people from being merciful, from being full of grace, from accepting the prayer of a repentant sinner, to anger and wrath and judgment. And there's such a huge difference between God's wrath and God's grace that the change, the realization of the change, I would submit to you, was brought on a shock that caused silence for half an hour. And then, so that silence is actually the result, or how we can remember the seventh seal brings silence. And then John saw 7 angels, and these 7 angels had 7 trumpets that were given to them. So the book of Revelation is a book of sevens. You will see in the book of Revelation, it starts with 7 churches. And we've walked through those 7 churches. Did I spell that right? No? Yep. And then after the 7 churches, you have 7 seals. And we have walked through those. Now we have 7 angels who blow 7 trumpets. And in the future, we will see that we have not only 7 trumpets, but 7 bowls of God's wrath. Do you see? There's a...
Not the E.
Pardon?
Bowls.
Sorry. Bowls of God's wrath. So we see the 7 repeated at least 4 times in the book of Revelation. We have seen these 2 already, but these 2, when they come together, they emphasize the wrath of God. And unfortunately, they take up a huge part of the book of Revelation. In fact, the wrath of God starts, if I understand it correctly, it starts in chapter 8, and it doesn't finish until chapter 18. So that's a huge chunk of the book of Revelation. So John sees 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. Now there's another angel in verse 3 This isn't one of those 7 angels that had the 7 trumpets. This is another one. But this angel had a golden censer. And this angel came and stood at the altar. And this golden censer was full of something. And it was full of incense. And the offering, he offered this incense with the prayers of all the saints. And he offered these on the golden altar before the throne. And he's picturing the throne room in heaven that we talked about in chapter 4 and chapter 5. And this offering went up before God from the angel's hand. Now I want you to think about this offering here. There may be a disagreement about this, I don't even know. But there seems to be a reference back to the prayers of God's people that we saw in the 5th seal. Chapter 6, verse 9. I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they maintained. They called out in a loud voice, "How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth?" Well, this is how long. This is the fulfillment of their prayers. In fact, I want to say this carefully. When you pray for somebody to come to Christ, it's powerful and you should do it. But if they refuse to come to Christ, those prayers will end up being held against those people. In other words, you had somebody that cared for you. You had somebody who prayed for you. You had somebody who witnessed to you and wanted you to come to Christ, but you refused. And I want you to notice what happens to here. There's the prayers of God's people going before God all the time, and then the angel, verse 5, takes the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and hurled it on the earth. No longer is this fire being used as an incense before God of worship. Now this fire is being used in a different way. It's being used for judgment, and it's being hurled down at the earth instead of ascending as incense to God. It's being hurled down at the earth, and with that hurling of this fire that the angel took from the censer, there came peals of thunder, rumblings, flashings of lightning, and an earthquake. Have you ever heard of this kind of a description before? If you have read Exodus lately, you probably have. Because when God came down on the mountain of Sinai, what happened? There was an earthquake, and there was thunder, and there was lightning, and there was rumblings. All of these things, flashes of lightning, rumblings of thunder, and an earthquake, all happened at Sinai when God came down. And now in chapter 8 of Revelation, when God is unleashing his wrath, his anger against the people who are unbelieving, God comes down, and you see this. God comes down in his anger and wrath, and you see the same signs starting to take place. Then we get to what is called the first of the trumpets. And I'm going to read for you Well, the rest of the chapter, starting at verse 6. Then the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared to sound them. The first angel sounded his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and it was hurled down on the earth. A third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. The second angel sounded his trumpet, and something like a huge mountain, all ablaze, was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea turned into blood. A third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. The third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky on a third of the rivers and on the streams of water. The name of the star was Wormwood. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. The fourth angel sounded his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them turned dark. A third of the day was without light, and also a third of the night. As I watched, I heard an angel that was flying in midair call out in a loud voice, "Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because of the trumpet blasts about to be sounded by the other 3 angels." So we have the first 4 of the trumpets. Now I want you to remember what happened in chapter 6. We had the first 6 of the 7 seals, right? Now in chapter 8 we get the first 4 of the 7 trumpets. Let's take a look at these trumpets. These trumpets are painful in how strong desolation comes to the earth. God is angry with the people who have sinned against him and the people who have rejected Jesus Christ as their only Savior. And as a result of his anger, he is taking out his wrath. He is destroying many of the people who are alive on the earth at that time. First of all, let's look at verse 7. We see the first angel sounded his trumpet. And we have what we call the action. There is hail, fire, blood, and that was hurled down on the earth. And the result of the action was that a third of the earth was burned up. Can't even quite imagine what a big swath a third of the earth might be. You know, people are saying that it's terrible what the pandemic has done to our world because, what is it, over 1% of the people in the world have died because of the pandemic? But that's 1%. 1/3 is 33 and a third percent. Or 33 and a third, that's just a third of the earth. And when you see that many people die, it's going to be so massive, so amazing, that people will shake with fear because of how awesome and how dreadful this thing is happening. And it's talking about burning. The earth, a third of the earth was burned up, a third of the trees was burned up, and all the grass burned up. We've seen grass fires in California, haven't we? And we've seen that they can be actually helpful if they're maintained in the right place, but they can be terribly destructive if they get out of control. And when you're talking about a third of the earth, you're not talking about any control. It's just a terrible burning that is happening. But then when I think about it, and I told you back in the previous verse that it reminded me of Exodus, if you go back to Exodus chapter 9, we have the plagues that God sent on the Egyptians. And you know what some of the plagues were? Hail and fire. And it's almost like God is repeating for the people during the time of his wrath what God did to the Egyptians during the time of the plagues. So the first trumpet is hail and fire. The second trumpet is a large mountain all ablaze being thrown into the sea. And I want you to see what happened. As a result of that action, a third of the sea is turned to blood. Going back to the Moses time, there's still a relationship, isn't there? Remember when Moses turned the water into blood and the fish died? Well, that's happening again. But it's happening on a much more massive scale than what happened in Egypt. This is happening to a third of the earth's surface. A third of the sea turned into blood. A third of the living creatures in the sea died. And a third of the ships were destroyed. Why were they destroyed? Because they could no longer exist on blood. They died. So we have hail and fire. From Exodus chapter 9, verse 22 to 25, we see a parallel. Then we see the second angel with his trumpet, and we find the water or the sea turning to blood. And that parallels with Exodus chapter 7, verse 19. And then we see the third angel that sounded his trumpet. And what happens? There is a great blazing star that falls from heaven. And what was the result? Again, there's something about this third, because it's repeated over and over again. It landed on a third of the rivers. We were talking about a third of the sea before. That's the salt water. Now we're talking about the fresh water. We're talking about a third of the rivers and springs of water. And they turn bitter. And the result of these springs turning bitter is that people have nothing to drink, and therefore they die. And bitter water is found in Exodus chapter 15, verse 22 to 26. So we see a very close parallel where God, when his wrath is being displayed on people, people can't exist under his wrath. People die. And then we get to the fourth angel sounding his trumpet. Verse 12. And a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon was struck, and a third of the stars were struck. And the result of this was they turned dark. So when you have darkness coming on these great luminaries, guess what? Again, there is death as a result. Because our plants and our animals and everybody lives by the light of the sun and the moon and the stars. And again, God used darkness in the story of the Exodus. Exodus chapter 10, verse 21 to 23. So we see that God is showing his wrath on an unbelieving world by killing off basically 1/3 of the world. Killing off the sea, burning up the land, and burning up the clear waters. It's all being destroyed. But then we get to verse 13, and this is only the beginning of the wrath of God that is going to be relayed on the earth. John heard the eagle call out in the loud voice, and the eagle called out 3 woes to the inhabitants of the earth. And the eagle did this because the 3 trumpet blasts which were about to sound. In other words, we've heard the 4 so far, but the 3 that are coming up are even worse than the 4 that we have already seen. I don't know if people understand this, and I think it has been misunderstood because of the pre-tribulation view. The pre-tribulation view believes that the people are going to be saved during the tribulation. I don't believe that's what's going to happen. They'll be saved during the tribulation, but they're not going to be saved during the day of wrath. During the day of wrath, it's a time of punishment, and people will want to die, and people will want to get out of it, but they aren't going to turn to the Lord for salvation. This is a time of death and destruction and God's wrath on a sinful, unbelieving world. Just as a preview of coming attractions, the 5th angel sounds his trumpet, and that is known as the first woe. We'll cover that in chapter 9, verses 1 to 12. The 6th angel sounds his trumpet, and that's the second woe. That's in chapter 9, verse 13 to 11, chapter 11, verse 14. And then the 7th angel sounds his trumpet, and that's the third woe, and that covers chapter 11, verse 15 to chapter 12, verse 17. So these trumpets are having a devastating effect on the earth. And you might, somebody say, well, I might be part of the 2/3 that live. You might be, but it's going to be a very diminished kind of life at that point, because so much around you has died. People won't be able to know how to bury all the dead. It will be a catastrophe of epidemic proportion. It will be something that will shock people. And that's what's coming on this earth when God's people are out of here. And it's a very sad story. Questions, comments?